Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the history of drag bars. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time together, exploring another corner of LGBTQ plus history. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ plus history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoyed tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. There is a kind of room that exists across time. It doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it's a cellar beneath a city street, reached by a door that swings open only after the right knock. Sometimes it's a long, low building on a corner in North Beach, San Francisco, with a marquee sign that glows warm in the evening fog. Sometimes it's a ballroom in Harlem on a winter night, every chandelier burning. The floor packed with thousands of people who have come from all over the city to watch something extraordinary happen under the lights. But whatever the room looks like from the outside, the inside always has the same quality. Something about it is different from the rest of the world. The air feels different. The rules feel different. The things that feel impossible everywhere else start to feel, inside this particular room, at least partially possible. Tonight, we're going to spend our time together, tracing the history of those rooms. We're going to start in the 1880s, in the streets of Washington, D.C., and we're going to travel forward through time, stopping along the way at speakeasies and cabarets, at Broadway-adjacent showrooms and Parisian nightclubs, at the edge of riots and the beginning of festivals, all the way to an Emmy-winning television stage. And through all of it, we're going to follow the story of drag, of the performers who brought it to life, and the bars and ballrooms and spaces where it found its home. This is not a story that moves in a straight line. It doubles back on itself. It loses ground and then gains it. It lives underground for decades and then surfaces into daylight and then retreats again. It is interrupted by laws and riots and economic collapses and cultural shifts that change everything. And then it continues anyway. Because the thing about these rooms, the thing that makes them worth all this time and attention, is that they persisted through all of it. The rooms kept their lights on, so get comfortable. Pull your blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. There is no rush tonight. We have hours ahead of us, and we are going to take every one of them. This story is going to ask something of you that bedtime stories don't always ask. It's going to ask you to hold some difficult things alongside the beautiful things, to let the persecution and the loss and the cost of this history sit beside the joy and the resilience and the art. It's going to ask you to stay with certain people, even when what happened to them is hard to stay with. But I promise you that what's worth finding in this history is genuinely worth finding. The joy is real. The art is real. The community that built itself across more than a century, in the face of everything that was trying to prevent it from existing. That community is real. The rooms are real. And there is something restful, in a deep way, about knowing that people have always found each other, that the rooms have always, somehow, managed to keep their lights on. That's what we're here for tonight. So, let's begin. Let's begin. To understand where drag bars came from, it helps to go back much further than you might expect. not just to the 1920s, or even to the late 1800s. It helps to go all the way back to London, to a wooden theatre on the south bank of the River Thames, to a stage where, in the early 1600s, a young man in a heavy costume dress was walking through a rehearsal, and the hem of that dress was dragging across the floor behind him with every step he took. We don't know his name. We don't know what the play was. We don't know whether it was raining that day in London, whether the Thames was grey or silver under the sky, whether the other performers were watching him carefully or had their backs turned, absorbed in their own preparations. We don't know if he was tired, or cold, or thinking about something else entirely. But archival documentation suggests that this is where the word drag came from that very specific, very physical sensation of a heavy costume dress pulling along the boards of a rehearsal stage at the Globe Theatre in London in the 17th century. It's a strangely humble origin for a word that would eventually come to mean so much. The Globe Theatre was a large, round, open-air structure in Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, where it had been built at the very end of the 16th century. It was one of the great theatrical venues of its era, and in the early decades of the 17th century, it was closely associated with the work of William Shakespeare and his company. Audiences who came to the Globe sat on wooden benches in the galleries, or stood in the yard, the open area in front of the stage, for hours at a time, watching performances that ranged from comedies to histories to tragedies. They ate and talked and moved around and paid attention and lost attention and paid attention again. The Globe was a living, breathing, democratic space. And in the 17th century, at the Globe and at other London stages of the Shakespearean era, the law and the church stood firmly against women performing in public. The reasons were complicated. A tangle of religious tradition, very particular ideas about female propriety and the dangers of female public display, and anxieties about the moral corruption that might result from women showing themselves on a stage for the entertainment of strangers. Whatever the reasons, the practical effect was simple and absolute. Women were not permitted to act in public theatrical productions, not on the professional stage, not at the Globe, not anywhere that audiences paid money to sit and watch. And since theatre requires both male and female characters, since comedy needs its heroines, and tragedy needs its queens, and its mothers, and its daughters, men had to fill those female roles, specifically young men, boys, and adolescents whose voices hadn't yet changed, whose faces were still smooth enough to suggest femininity with the help of makeup and costume. These were not amateur efforts. The young men who played female roles in Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre trained extensively. They were apprentices in theatrical companies, learning their craft the way other apprentices learned theirs, through years of observation and instruction and practice and performance, through paying close attention to what worked and what didn't, through absorbing the accumulated knowledge of the people they worked alongside. The performance of femininity on stage was taken as seriously as any other theatrical skill. These young men learned to move differently, to carry their weight differently, to speak differently, to use their voices in registers that would read to an audience as female. And the costumes for these female roles were elaborate. Heavy skirts, full sleeves, bodices that transformed the shape of the body beneath them, creating a silhouette that bore no natural resemblance to the body of the young man wearing it. Headdresses and jewellery, and the layers of material that wealthy Elizabethan fashion required. The materials were expensive, or at least detailed imitations of expensive things, and they had weight and structure and heft that a modern person, accustomed to light synthetic fabrics, might find surprising. When you moved in them, they moved with you, but with their own momentum, their own resistance. They had opinions about how you moved. When you walked across a stage, or across the boards of a rehearsal room, the hem traced the path of your steps, and it dragged. The word, the research tells us, emerged from these theatrical contexts, referring to the way heavy costume dresses would drag across the floor during rehearsals. What began, as the research notes, as a logistical solution, evolved into a foundational, theatrical craft. Drag, then, began as a description, a word that emerged from the purely physical reality of performing gender in a context where gender was a theatrical assignment rather than a personal truth. The men who played these roles were not, in any sense that the period would have recognized, doing anything other than playing a role. The performance ended when rehearsal ended. The costume came off. The character dissolved. But the word persisted, and that word would eventually travel much further than anyone in any of those rehearsal rooms could have imagined. Let's slow down for a moment and really stay with the Elizabethan theatre, with the Globe, with the rehearsal rooms where the young men who played female roles were learning their art. Let's be there for a moment. You are an apprentice in a theatrical company in early 17th century London. You are young, perhaps 15, perhaps 17. You have been with this company for some years now, observing and assisting and practicing, and you are beginning to be trusted with real roles. Today, you are working on a scene from a new play. Your character is a young woman, a noblewoman perhaps, or a shepherdess, disguised as something else. The plays of this era love disguise. Or the daughter of a powerful man, caught in circumstances that are testing her in ways she didn't anticipate. Whatever the character, she is specifically, unmistakably, a woman. And your job is to make an audience of Londoners, standing in the yard or sitting in the galleries, people who know perfectly well that they are looking at a young man, believe in her. You are wearing the costume for the first time in a full rehearsal. The dress is heavier than you expected, and you had been warned that it would be heavy. The fabric is stiff and elaborate, layers of it, structured, designed to present a particular silhouette that has nothing to do with your own natural shape. The bodice constrains your breathing in ways you will need to learn to work around before opening day. The sleeves are cumbersome in a way that will, over time, start to feel natural, but right now feel unfamiliar. And when you walk across the rehearsal room floor, the hem moves with you, sweeping the boards, catching slightly on every imperfection in the surface. You can feel the weight of it at the back of your steps. Dragging. You are learning something that generations of performers before you have had to learn. That performing femininity is physical labor. That it changes how you move, how you breathe, how you hold your body. That the costume is not simply decoration applied to the outside of what you would otherwise be, but an active participant in the performance, shaping you as much as you shape it. This is where it begins. This specific physical experience on a specific stage, in a specific city, centuries ago. And the word that came from it would travel further and mean more than any of the people in that rehearsal room could have known. By the time we reach the early 20th century, the art of what was then called female impersonation had travelled a long way from the boards of the Globe Theatre. It had crossed the Atlantic. It had moved through theatrical traditions and performance contexts that the Elizabethan stage couldn't have anticipated, and it had found, in America, in the early 1900s, a perfect vehicle. Vaudeville. Vaudeville was the dominant form of popular entertainment in America at the turn of the century. It was a variety format, a series of unrelated acts performed one after another on the same stage, in the same theatre, on the same evening. Comedy sketches, musical numbers performed by solo singers or small groups, acrobats, magicians, trained animal acts that ranged from the charming to the absurd, dramatic monologues delivered by performers who could hold an audience's attention through the sheer force of personality. Each act occupied perhaps 10 or 15 minutes of stage time, and then the next would begin. The vaudeville audience could come and go throughout the evening. The format accommodated that looseness, that informality. You could arrive partway through and catch everything from that point on. You could leave early if you needed to, and feel you had gotten your money's worth. The whole experience was designed to be friendly and accessible and endlessly varied. Vaudeville theatres existed in virtually every city and town of any size in America. From the great vaudeville palaces of New York and Chicago, enormous, ornate buildings that could hold thousands of people, to the smaller regional theatres that stretched across the country into places that had no other professional entertainment at all. Vaudeville was how ordinary Americans saw live performance. It was affordable, accessible, and democratic in a way that opera and theatre were not. And within this format, female impersonation had evolved. It had moved from being a supporting novelty, something that might appear in the middle of an evening's lineup to generate a laugh, or a gasp, or a moment of curious attention before the programme moved on, into something that could headline, something that could be the reason people bought their tickets on a specific night rather than a different one. Something that could make a performer famous in a country where fame was increasingly understood to mean the recognition of strangers who had never met you. No one made it more famous than Julian Eltinge. Julian Eltinge stands as the era's high-profile exemplar of what female impersonation could be when it was taken seriously as a theatrical art form. He stands, in the researcher's words, as the figure who represented the transition of the form from a supporting novelty to a headlining act. His success was, the research notes, a historical anomaly. An anomaly not because female impersonation was uncommon on the vaudeville stage, but because of the extraordinary scale of what Eltinge achieved within it. At his peak, Julian Eltinge became the world's highest paid actor, and not the highest paid actor of a particular type, or the most successful performer in a specialized niche, the highest paid actor in the world. At times, the research tells us, he was out-earning Charlie Chaplin. Let's stay with that for a moment, because it deserves the pause. Charlie Chaplin. One of the most famous human beings on the planet in the early decades of the 20th century. The little tramp character he had created was recognized in every country where moving pictures had reached, which by the 1910s and 1920s was most of the world. His films were seen by millions of people. His image was iconic in a way that very few images in all of human history have ever been. The baggy suit, the cane, the bowler hat, the distinctive walk. And Julian Eltinge, a performer whose entire act was built around the careful, sophisticated, technically demanding performance of femininity, was at times earning more than he was. This is not a small fact. What Eltinge was doing on those vaudeville stages was not simply putting on a dress and walking around. It was a total transformation, a complete reimagining of his physical presentation. The makeup applied in ways that the theatrical technology of the time allowed, and that required both skill and time. The costuming, which was elaborate and careful and expensive. The movement, the way he walked, the way he held his hands, the way he turned his head and used his voice. All of it was carefully constructed to create what the research describes as a sophisticated theatrical illusion. His audiences came not to laugh at him, but to marvel at the craft, to be genuinely amazed at what one person could do with materials and technique and concentration. The research frames Eltinge's moment as a pre-criminalization era, a period before the laws and social attitudes that would later be used to persecute gender non-conforming people had hardened into their most rigid and punishing forms. In this window, the art of female impersonation was celebrated, not by a hidden subculture, not by a community gathering in private, but by a mainstream cisgender audience, by the ordinary families who filled the vaudeville theatres of America in the first decades of the 20th century. He was understood as a sophisticated theatrical artist. He was covered by the press with the same admiring attention paid to any other major entertainer. His gender nonconformity was framed, for public consumption, as artistry, as craft, as a remarkable technical skill, deployed in the service of theatrical illusion. What Eltinge and his contemporaries were doing was laying the foundation for something that would eventually become much more than theatrical craft. They were establishing female impersonation as a legitimate and serious form of American entertainment. They were creating audiences who knew how to watch it, who had learned to appreciate it, and they were developing a performance tradition that future performers, in very different contexts, with very different relationships to what they were doing, would inherit and transform. The tradition wouldn't stay in those well-lit vaudeville theatres forever. It would move underground. It would find its community. It would become something that its mainstream commercial origins couldn't have contained. But the foundation had been laid. The word was in circulation. The audiences had been taught to watch. And the performers themselves, the Julian Eltingers, the people who stood under those vaudeville lights and gave what they gave, had done something that outlasted the commercial context in which they worked. They had demonstrated that this form of expression could compel an audience, that the performance of gender, when executed with skill and care, could hold a room. They had drawn people out of their homes and into their seats for this specific experience. Whatever the mainstream audiences of the early 20th century believed they were watching, craft, illusion, theatrical skill, they had given their attention to it. They had leaned forward. They had been moved, or surprised, or delighted, or all three. That experience of being in the audience for something that rearranges your sense of what's possible, that had happened. For a few minutes, or an hour, or an evening, the people in those vaudeville theatres had seen something that expanded the perimeter of the imaginable. And even if they went home and didn't think about it again, even if the specific details of what they'd seen were absorbed into the larger blur of their daily lives, something had been placed in them, some understanding, however inarticulate, that the categories they'd assumed were fixed had demonstrated a capacity for movement. This is how cultural change happens, often. Not loudly, not in moments that anyone recognizes in real time as significant, but slowly, invisibly, through the accumulation of experiences that don't feel significant in the moment, but that collectively shift what feels possible. The vaudeville audiences of the early 20th century were, without knowing it, part of a long process, a process that would continue through the speakeasies and the ballrooms and the cabarets and the riots and the festivals and all the rest of what we're going to talk about tonight. They were just one generation in a very long story. While Julian Eltinge was performing to mainstream audiences on the vaudeville circuit, something else was happening in Washington, D.C. Something quieter, less commercially visible, and in some ways much more significant to the specific history we're tracing tonight. In the 1880s, a man named William Dorsey Swann was organizing drag balls. Let's take a moment to really place ourselves in the historical context of what this means, because the details here are important. The 1880s in Washington, D.C. This is roughly 2 decades after the end of the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, the era in which the federal government had attempted to rebuild the South and extend civil rights and political participation to the people who had been enslaved, was effectively over by the late 1870s. The promises of Reconstruction had been systematically dismantled through a combination of political compromise in Washington, organized white supremacist violence throughout the South, and the withdrawal of the federal troops who had provided at least a degree of physical protection to black communities in the years immediately following the war. The period that followed Reconstruction was characterized by the rapid and deliberate erosion of the rights that black Americans had briefly held. Jim Crow laws were being enacted across the South. Violence, lynching, riots, organized terror was being used to enforce racial hierarchy. The federal government, which might theoretically have intervened to protect the constitutional rights that had been enacted, was largely absent from this struggle. And in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country that had just fought a war over slavery and nominally enshrined black freedom in its constitution, the post-Reconstruction period was its own particular and complicated reality. The city was home to a significant black community, including many people who had made their way there in the years after emancipation looking for something different. And within that community, William Dorsey Swann was creating something specific and deliberate. Swann had been born into slavery. After emancipation, he made his life in Washington, and in the 1880s, he organized drag balls, gatherings where a group of people could come together in a private space, wear what they chose to wear, present themselves as they chose to present themselves, and find community with others who understood what that meant and what it cost. These were not small events held in secret, because no one cared or noticed. They attracted the attention of law enforcement. Swan's balls were raided. He was targeted by the authorities. The risks of attending or organising such an event were real, and the consequences of those risks could be severe. And yet the balls continued. What Swan curated, the research tells us, were spaces where the intersectionality of race and gender performance functioned as a radical political act. Let's stay with that. The intersectionality of race and gender performance. These two things, being black in post-Reconstruction America and being gender non-conforming, were not two separate things that happened to coincide in the lives of the people at Swan's balls. They were woven together into a single, specific experience of moving through a world that was hostile on multiple fronts simultaneously. The post-Reconstruction violence was racial in its explicit target. The laws against gender nonconformity were explicitly about gender, but the people targeted by both were people whose race and gender identity were inseparable parts of who they were. They could not separate these things out, even if they had wanted to. The world would not let them. To gather in the face of that, to dress in ways the state might at any moment decide to criminalize, to claim visibility and community and celebration when the world outside was doing everything it could to enforce invisibility and confinement. This was not merely a party. This was not simply a night off from the daily pressures of a difficult life. These were, the research notes, intentional assertions of identity and community in the face of post-Reconstruction state violence. Intentional. The word matters. These gatherings were not accidental. They were chosen, they were organised, they were defended, and they marked, the research tells us, the beginning of a lineage of queer resistance that prioritised the visibility of people of colour. The beginning of a lineage, something that started here in the 1880s, in private spaces, in Washington, D.C., and that would run forward through time for more than a century, connecting generations of performers and community members and activists and ordinary people who refused to accept the invisibility the mainstream world imposed on them. This lineage runs through everything we're going to discuss tonight. The Hamilton Lodge Ball in Harlem, the ballroom houses of the 1970s and 1980s. Every moment in this history where queer people of colour built spaces for themselves, organised community around themselves, made themselves visible to each other when the world outside would not see them. It begins here, with William Dorsey Swan, in Washington, D.C., in the 1880s. So, as we leave the 1880s and move forward toward the 20th century, we have these two different traditions running in parallel. On one side, there's the theatrical tradition, Julian Eltinge and his contemporaries performing for mainstream vaudeville audiences, the art of female impersonation celebrated as craft. The performer understood as an artist creating a sophisticated illusion for an audience that has paid to be entertained. This tradition had money. It had visibility. It had mainstream approval and press coverage, and the admiration of audiences who would never have understood themselves as connected to any kind of queer history. On the other side, there's the community tradition. William Dorsey Swan, creating spaces for people whose identities the mainstream world did not accommodate or protect. Spaces that existed in private, gathered in the face of legal and social hostility, organised not around entertainment in any commercial sense, but around belonging. Around the fundamental human need to be among people who understand you. These two traditions were not entirely separate. They surely knew of each other. The people who organised drag balls in the 1880s and 1890s must have been aware of the theatrical tradition of female impersonation. The performers in the theatrical tradition surely knew that the art they practiced had a different life offstage. But the contexts were different, the purposes were different, and the communities involved were different. As we move into the 1920s, these two traditions are going to begin to find each other in new ways, in shared physical spaces, in overlapping audiences, in the same rooms, not completely, and not without significant tension. But the decade that's coming is going to create conditions that didn't exist before. The decade of prohibition. And the thing that historians would eventually call the pansy craze. Let's rest here for a moment before we move on. The 1880s. William Dorsey Swann in Washington, D.C. The beginning of a lineage. The turn of the century. Julian Eltinge on the vaudeville stage, out-earning Charlie Chaplin, the world's highest-paid actor. The word drag in circulation, carrying the memory of heavy costume hems on the boards of an Elizabethan stage. Everything still to come. Take a slow breath. We're in no hurry tonight. On the 16th of January, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect. The amendment had been the project of decades of work by the temperance movement, a broad coalition of people who believed that alcohol was a destructive force in American life, that it drove poverty and violence and the dissolution of families and the corruption of character. They had worked through churches and civic organizations and political campaigns to bring this moment about. And so, with the completion of a legal and political process that had taken years, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors became illegal throughout the entire United States. The people who had campaigned for prohibition believed it would produce a more orderly, more virtuous, more moral society. They believed that removing alcohol from public life would solve or at least reduce many of the social problems they had identified as connected to it. They were right about the transformation. They were wrong about its direction. What prohibition actually produced was the speakeasy. Speakeasies. Illegal bars that sold alcohol in defiance of the law, spread through every American city with remarkable speed and adaptability. They were hidden in basements, tucked behind false walls, located beneath perfectly ordinary-looking storefronts, or in the back rooms of establishments that were legal on their visible face. They were reached by passwords and secret knocks, by knowing the right person, by saying the right thing to the right person at the right moment. They existed in a kind of shadow world, just below the surface of ordinary daily life, and they required a very specific kind of relationship to law and authority, to run and to patronize. The people who ran speakeasies were, by definition, already outside the law. They were criminals in the strictly legal sense, not because they had done anything that most ordinary people would consider genuinely harmful, but because they were selling alcohol in a country that had decided alcohol was illegal. And this had a very particular social effect. When you are already a criminal, when the very act of pouring someone a drink makes you an outlaw in the legal sense, the other categories of respectability and criminality start to blur in interesting ways. The boundary between what is permitted and what is forbidden has already been crossed, repeatedly, as a matter of ordinary business. The research describes it this way. Prohibition created a smoky haze where social boundaries between respectability and criminality were suspended. And in that suspension, in that particular atmosphere of permissiveness that comes from having already decided to do the illegal thing, just by walking through the door, something flowered. The research calls these underground bars fairylands, these subterranean fairylands, a term that people at the time apparently used to describe them, were places where, as the research puts it, patrons were encouraged to spurn convention, where the social rules that governed everyday public life had been already partially set aside just by the act of being there. And into these spaces, in the 1920s, came the performers who would create what historians now call the pansy craze. The 18th Amendment, the research tells us, inadvertently served as a catalyst for this moment by criminalizing pleasure, by driving social life underground, by creating venues where the normal rules were already suspended and where the audience had already demonstrated a certain willingness to exist outside what was officially permitted. Prohibition created the conditions under which gender non-conforming performers were catapulted into a brief period of fashionable stardom. Let's stay with that word, catapulted, not gradually accepted, not slowly permitted, not welcomed through some careful process of social negotiation over many years. Catapulted, thrown suddenly, by accident, by the strange social alchemy of a law that was trying to accomplish something entirely different. A law about alcohol had created the conditions for something that had nothing to do with alcohol, a moment in which gender non-conforming performance became, briefly, fashionable. This is how history often works. The thing that changes everything is rarely the thing that was trying to change everything. The pansy craze had a geography. It was not evenly distributed across the country. It had centers, epicenters where the phenomenon was most concentrated and most vivid and most visibly a part of public nightlife. The underground spaces of the pansy craze era were called, in the parlance of the time, fairylands. The people who named them, that chose that word deliberately, they were gesturing towards something specific, something enchanted, something that existed outside ordinary time and ordinary rules. A fairyland is a place where the normal laws are suspended, where transformations happen that would be impossible anywhere else, where the boundaries between what you appear to be and what you could be are thinner and more permeable than they are in the ordinary world. The undisputed capital, the research tells us, was New York City, and within New York, the pansy craze lived most vividly in two very different neighborhoods, Greenwich Village and Harlem. Greenwich Village in the 1920s was already known as a place where artists and writers and bohemians gathered, where the conventional rules of mainstream American society felt slightly less binding. Nightclubs and cabarets in the neighborhood integrated pansy acts, performances by gender non-conforming entertainers, into their regular programming. And pansy acts were integrated into Broadway productions and into the major nightclubs of New York City more broadly. Harlem was experiencing its own extraordinary cultural moment in this same period. The Harlem Renaissance was in full flower, that remarkable flowering of black, artistic, and intellectual and creative life that transformed American culture in the 1920s and early 1930s. The clubs and cabarets of Harlem were among the most vibrant cultural spaces in the entire country. Into Harlem, too, the pansy craze spread and found its particular expression. And then there was the Hamilton Lodge Ball. The research describes it as drawing thousands of spectators. Not hundreds, thousands. Among those spectators was Langston Hughes, one of the great voices of the Harlem Renaissance, a poet whose work was shaping the way Black America understood and expressed itself. We will come back to the Hamilton Lodge Ball in much more detail later in this story, because it deserves its own careful attention. For now, simply hold it in your mind. Thousands of people in Harlem gathered to see something extraordinary. Chicago was another major center of the pansy craze, and the research notes something specific and interesting about the character of that city's version of it. The historical records suggest a relatively tolerant atmosphere during the peak of the craze, an atmosphere in which performers drawn into this world reported little fear of immediate police oppression. Little fear of immediate police oppression. That phrase deserves to be read carefully, because it tells you as much about what was normal as about what was exceptional. For much of the history we're going to trace tonight, fear of police is not an abstract concern, but an ever-present daily reality. The threat of arrest, of having a venue raided and closed, of licenses being revoked, of harassment and violence from the very people who are officially supposed to be keeping the public safe. These are constants in the history of queer nightlife throughout most of the 20th century. Los Angeles had its own character in the pansy craze story. The research describes it as a destination for performers fleeing East Coast crackdowns. As the pansy craze began to encounter resistance in New York and other eastern cities, some performers made their way west. In Los Angeles, pansy stuff was integrated into the early talkies, the first sound films that were transforming the movie industry with breathtaking speed in the late 1920s. Miami was something different again. The research gives it a specific description. Miami was marketed by boosters as a tropical fairyland for wealthy tourists. A winter playground, a destination where people with enough money could escape the cold northern winters and experience a version of social life that felt more relaxed and more indulgent than what they maintained back home. The research describes Miami as a place where traditional social hierarchies were momentarily suspended in exclusive casinos. Momentarily suspended in exclusive casinos. This phrase contains everything important about what Miami's version of the pansy craze was. Temporary, conditional, economically gated, and ultimately in the service of the leisure of the wealthy, rather than the lives of a community. The performers who worked within the pansy craze were not interchangeable figures in a generalized phenomenon. They were individuals with distinct personalities, distinct artistic visions, and distinct relationships to what they were doing and what it meant. Jean Malin was, the research tells us, the definitive master of ceremonies of the New York scene. He brought the pansy style to the mainstream West 54th Street. His signature was a specific physical quality, a hand on a hip style, a gesture, a way of holding and presenting his body that was recognizable from across a room. This physical signature was influential enough that it inspired Broadway. Ray Bourbon was a different kind of figure. Where Marlin presided and organised, Bourbon represented something else, what the research calls the voyeuristic thrill sought by heterosexual audiences. Bourbon's performances were designed to give audiences who were not part of the queer community something specific they were looking for. The pleasure of watching something they understood as transgressive and exotic and exciting, from the safe position of the audience seat. Then there was Clifton Webb. Webb leaned into what the research calls Nance roles, characters described as dandies and Greenwich Village nuts. These were characters that contained a kind of coded gender nonconformity, without ever fully committing to the more explicit performance that someone like Jean Malin was offering. Webb used his proximity to mainstream theatre to thrive, while others faced increasing persecution. This phrase repays careful attention because it contains an entire ethical and social drama compressed into a single sentence. Webb's navigation was successful. For him. He found a way to incorporate enough of the craze's sensibility into his public persona, while staying close enough to mainstream theatrical respectability, that the persecution, which was beginning to fall on others, did not reach him in the same way, while others faced increasing persecution. That clause at the end is the one that matters most. Because even at the height of the pansy craze, even in the years when gender non-conforming performance was being catapulted into fashionable stardom, the forces that would eventually bring that period to an end were already gathering. 3 forces would dismantle the pansy craze, and they arrived in rapid succession, each one closing off something that had briefly been open. The first was the repeal of prohibition in 1933. This might seem paradoxical at first. Wasn't prohibition what had created the underground spaces where the craze flourished? And isn't the removal of a repressive law supposed to make things better, not worse? But the dynamic was more complicated. The speakeasies had operated entirely outside the legal system, which meant they were also, in a particular way, outside its reach. They couldn't have their licenses revoked because they didn't have licenses. They couldn't be regulated by the liquor authority because they didn't officially exist. With the repeal of prohibition, alcohol came back into the legal economy. Bars and nightclubs could now operate openly and legally. But operating legally meant being subject to oversight. It meant applying for and receiving liquor licenses. And liquor licenses meant that the state now had a tool, a formal, legal, bureaucratic tool, for controlling which establishments could operate and which could not. The state liquor authority would use that tool extensively against queer spaces in the decades that followed. The second force was the Great Depression. The research describes this as fueling a moral backlash against excess. The 1920s had been, at least for those with enough money to participate, a decade of spending and dancing and social experimentation and conspicuous pleasure. The Depression recast all of that. What had seemed glamorous and exciting and modern in 1928 seemed by 1932 like evidence of irresponsibility. The third force was the 1934 Production Code, a set of strict regulations imposed on the content of Hollywood films. The code governed in considerable detail what could and could not appear on screen. And among its effects was the erasure of queer characters from Hollywood films. The brief window in which pansy stuff had been integrated into early talkies closed. The screen went blank. the culture closed, and the pansy craze ended. The ending of the pansy craze had a human cost, and nowhere in this story is that cost more personally visible than in the story of Alden Garrison. Garrison was known in the world of the pansy craze as the belle of the pansy ball. The research describes him as a tragic case study in the outsider within status of black performers. At the 1931 Baltimore Ball, Garrison appeared in a flowing gown of eggshell satin with studded rhinestones and a tiara of similar crystals. These descriptions are specific. They are specific because someone recorded them. Someone thought it was worth writing down exactly what Alden Garrison looked like that night, in 1931. Someone looked at him and thought, this should not be forgotten. Eggshell satin, studded rhinestones, a tiara of similar crystals. The glamour of this is real, and the research is explicit about what it meant. It was an act of resistance against the poverty of Garrison's upbringing in DC's alley neighborhoods. To emerge from those alleys wearing eggshell satin and rhinestones and a crystal tiara, to arrive at the center of an event where thousands of people were gathered, was to make a claim. A specific, visible, embodied claim about what you were worth and what you were allowed to be. I am here. I am magnificent. I am seen. But when the pansy craze ended, Garrison had no safety net. He had no mainstream career to retreat to. He was celebrated within the community and utterly unprotected by it when things changed. Alden Garrison died in 1938. He was 30 years old. He died alone and malnourished. The research marks his death as the devastating end of this period of visibility. And it was all of that. But it was also the story of a specific person, a person who wore eggshell satin and rhinestones and a crystal tiara at a Baltimore ball in 1931, who was magnificent in the most complete and literal sense of that word, and who deserved so much more than what the world gave him. Let's rest with Alden Garrison for a while, with the tiara of crystals catching the light, with the eggshell satin flowing, with the 30 years that were not enough. Take a slow breath. While the pansy craze was burning brightly in New York and then guttering out, something else was beginning in San Francisco. San Francisco in the late 1920s was a city with a specific and well-developed character. It was a port city, which meant it had always attracted a more transient and cosmopolitan population than cities of comparable size that were further inland. And it had neighborhoods that had developed strong and durable identities over the years. North Beach was one of those neighborhoods. North Beach was, and still is, an area of Italian restaurants and coffee houses and bars, of narrow streets, and the smell of coffee and garlic and the sea, of conversation that spills out of open doors onto sidewalks, where people stop and talk longer than they intended to. It was a neighborhood with a strong sense of its own character, a neighborhood that had always attracted artists and writers and people who wanted to be near the particular kind of life it offered. And in North Beach, in the late 1920s, Marjorie and Joseph Finocchio opened a club. The club started as most lasting things start, modestly, experimentally, as a possibility that was still finding its shape. But the club found its audience, and it grew, and it found a more permanent sense of what it was. In 1936, Finocchio's moved to its permanent home at 506 Broadway Street in North Beach, and it would remain there, at that address, under that name, doing what it did, for more than 60 years. Until 1999, 63 years. Take a moment to let that settle. 63 years. In the world of American nightlife, which is notoriously, almost legendarily unstable, where clubs open and close constantly, where the life of a nightclub is measured in years, rather than decades. 63 years of continuous operation at a single address is extraordinary. It borders on impossible. The club opened when Franklin Roosevelt was beginning his first term as president. It was still operating when Bill Clinton was in his second term, and the internet was in the process of transforming the world. Between those 2 points in time, the club survived World War II and the post-war boom. It survived the McCarthy era. It survived the civil rights movement and the Summer of Love. It survived the AIDS crisis, which devastated San Francisco's queer community in the 1980s. It survived all of it, still at 506 Broadway Street, still lit, still doing what it had always done. That kind of institutional durability is remarkable in any context. In the context of a nightclub serving a queer community in a country that was actively hostile to that community for much of those 6 decades, it is, genuinely, almost unbelievable. Finocchio's served as a training ground for legendary performers. The names that appear in the archival record include Walter Hart, Lucian Phelps, and Ray Bourbon, figures who developed their craft within the specific environment of Finocchio's, who learned what they knew about the art of drag performance within those particular walls, under those particular lights, for those particular audiences. The fact that Finocchio's functioned as a training ground is significant. It tells us that the club was not simply a venue where established performers came to do what they already knew how to do. It was a place where performers were developed, where careers were begun, where the specific skills that a drag performer needed were learned and refined through practice and proximity to people who already knew how to do them. A training ground suggests a relationship between generations of performers, the experienced passing things onto the less experienced, skills being transmitted through observation and practice, and the specific atmosphere of a place that had been doing this for long enough to have accumulated a tradition. Over 63 years, there were many such generations at Finocchio's. For over 50 years, the research is explicit about this number. Finocchio's was an official stop on the Grey Line nightclub tour. Pause on that for a moment. More than 50 years. More than half the club's 63-year lifespan. For more than half a century, one of the stops on the Grey Line bus tour of San Francisco nightlife was 506 Broadway Street. The Grey Line was a bus tour company that offered organized nightlife excursions to visitors in San Francisco. These were not underground experiences or specialized tours for interested parties. They were mainstream tourist entertainment. And for more than 50 years, Finocchio's was part of that mainstream tourism. The research notes that this arrangement needs to be understood as representing what it calls a dual identity. There were 2 different things happening at Finocchio's simultaneously, and they had fundamentally different meanings for the different people who were present in the room on any given night. For the tourists, Finocchio's was a spectacle, a piece of San Francisco color, something to see, to observe, to be mildly surprised or amused by, something that gave them a voyeuristic experience. This voyeurism, the research notes, provided the financial stability that allowed the club to survive. But for the queer community, for the performers who worked there, for the regular patrons who came repeatedly and knew what they were seeing, the venue was, the research tells us, a vital sanctuary. A sanctuary. The word is deliberately chosen and carefully meant. A protected space. A space where the rules of the world outside don't fully apply, where certain threats are held back at the door. This is the tension that the research identifies as central to the history of mid-century drag spaces. The tension between commercialized sightseeing and internal community value. Both things were true simultaneously. The room was both commercial product and sacred space. The performances were both theatrical craft and genuine expression. The same performance, the same performers, the same room, received entirely differently by different people sitting in the same house. Something else was happening at Finocchio's across its long history. Something quieter and more gradual than the commercial arrangements, but in some ways more consequential. A conceptual transition was underway. To understand it, we need to hold two terms in mind with some care: female impersonation and drag. These terms might sound like different names for the same thing. They are not. Female impersonation, as the research describes it, was historically a straight-coded Victorian theatrical craft. An illusion created specifically for an audience. The critical emphasis is on the audience. Female impersonation was defined by its relationship to the people watching it. It was something done for viewers. A service provided to audiences who understood what they were watching as artistry, as illusion, as a technical achievement that was complete when the curtain came down. Drag, in contrast, evolved as an identity-based cultural expression. Here the emphasis shifts entirely, from the audience to the performer. Drag was not primarily about what the audience saw. It was about something the performer was doing that had meaning regardless of whether anyone was watching. Something rooted, not in craft deployed for entertainment, but in identity, expressed through performance. Finocchio's, the research tells us, existed on the cusp of this transition. It was a venue that hosted both kinds of performance simultaneously. Both the older tradition of female impersonation as theatrical illusion and the emerging culture of drag as identity, often in the same show, sometimes in the same performer. The research notes that Finocchio's hosted a diverse array of drag queens, trans people, and cisgender performers who began to shift the art form away from mere mimicry toward lived authenticity. Lived authenticity. The phrase is almost the exact opposite of theatrical illusion, where theatrical illusion points outward, toward the audience, toward the effect created. Lived authenticity points inward, towards something true about the person doing the performing. Not what you appear to be, what you are. This shift, from illusion to authenticity, from performance for others to expression of self, is one of the most significant transitions in the entire history of drag culture. And Finocchio's, this club on Broadway Street in North Beach, was one of the specific places where that transition was happening. When Finocchio's finally closed its doors in 1999, it was the end of something genuinely irreplaceable. Not just as a nightclub, not just as a business, as an accumulation of history. 63 years of specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable performances and people and moments. When a place like that closes, there is no reopening. The thing it was, the specific, particular accumulation of time and memory and practice and community that it had become cannot be transferred to a new address. It was what it was because of all the years it had been that thing. And all those years ended when the doors closed. 506, Broadway Street, North Beach, San Francisco, 1936 to 1999. Let's rest here for a moment before we move on. While Finocchio's was finding its long rhythm in San Francisco, something was happening on the other side of the world that would shape the history of drag bars in ways that no one fully anticipated. Paris, 1946. Paris in 1946 was a city that had survived something enormous. 4 years of occupation. 4 years of daily life under the administration of a foreign military government. The war had ended 12 months ago. Liberation had come 18 months ago. People were still sorting out what had happened, and what it meant, and who they were now, on the other side of it. And in this atmosphere of reconstruction and returning possibility, 2 venues opened that would change the history of transfeminine performance in Europe. The Second World War had ended the previous year. Paris had been occupied by German forces from June of 1940 until August of 1944. The city had been liberated by Allied forces and the French resistance in August of 1944, and the war in Europe had ended entirely in May of 1945. And now, in 1946, Paris was in the complicated and ongoing process of rebuilding itself, not just physically, but psychologically, socially, culturally. The city was trying to figure out what it was on the other side of what it had been through. It was in this atmosphere of reconstruction and possibility that 2 venues opened, which would become, in the researchers' phrase, ground zero for the development of modern transfeminine identities in Europe. 2 venues, 1 city, and 2 very different philosophies. The first was Madame Arthur. Madame Arthur opened in 1946 in the Pigalle neighborhood. Pigalle is a specific and distinctive kind of neighborhood, one of the most specific kinds in the world, with an identity so particular that it has been recognizable for more than a century. It has always been a place of nightlife, of cabarets and theatres and small clubs that operated at an angle to mainstream Parisian respectability. The research describes Madame Arthur as a nursery, a word that implies cultivation, growth, the careful tending of something young and not yet fully formed until it is ready for the world. Madame Arthur was a nursery for transfeminine performance, and that philosophy was comedy. The style at Madame Arthur was grotesque, a term with specific meaning in theatrical and artistic tradition. Grotesque means deliberately heightened, exaggerated, pushed to extremes for effect. Femininity at Madame Arthur was often played for laughs. The second venue was Le Carrousel. Le Carrousel opened in 1947, just 1 year after Madame Arthur. While Madame Arthur was in Pigalle, Le Carrousel was near the Champs-Élysées. A venue near the Champs-Élysées was operating in an entirely different social and economic register. It was positioned, by its location alone, as a high-prestige establishment. Le Carrousel was managed by Marcel Wiesmann and Madame Germaine, and it catered to what the research describes as an international, wealthy clientele. And the philosophy at Le Carrousel was the opposite of Madame Arthur's. Where Madame Arthur approached femininity as comedy, Le Carrousel approached it with what the research calls sincerity. The performers here aimed for a sincere femininity. They were not exaggerating. They were not playing anything for laughs. They were presenting femininity as something genuine, as something real, as something that deserved to be received seriously and on its own terms. Together, Madame Arthur and Le Carrousel were ground zero for the development of modern transfeminine identities in Europe. The comedy of one and the sincerity of the other, these were not contradictory approaches, but complementary ones. Two different ways of making space for people whose gender expression didn't fit the mainstream categories. Among all the performers who moved through these Parisian venues in the post-war years, one stands out in the historical record for the specific and remarkable form that her significance took. Jacqueline Dufresnoy performed under the stage name Coccinelle. The name means ladybug in French, something small and brightly coloured, something that catches the eye immediately, something that seems delicate but is in fact quite resilient. Coccinelle became, the research tells us, a global symbol of trans possibility. Let's stay with that phrase very carefully, because it is doing something precise. Not a symbol of trans existence. Trans people had always existed. What Coccinelle represented was possibility. The sense that a certain kind of life was imaginable, achievable, something that someone had already done, and therefore might be something that you too could do. This is the specific mechanism by which representation creates possibility. It requires examples. It requires being able to see, or to hear about, or to read about someone who has done a thing before you can fully believe that thing is possible for you. Coccinelle provided the example. In 1958, she appeared in the film Europa di Notte. A film travels in ways that a performer cannot. It makes its subjects visible in cities and countries they have never visited. People in South America, in Africa, in Asia, in small towns across Europe and North America could watch Europa di Notte and see Coccinelle in a way they could never have seen her on the stage near the Champs-Élysées. And then, in 1960, Coccinelle underwent surgical transition in Casablanca. The research notes that this was documented extensively in the world press, not in a specialized publication, not whispered about in small communities, documented extensively in the world press, in newspapers and magazines in multiple countries and multiple languages, reaching the people who read those newspapers and magazines about everything else happening in their world. Her international tours, which the research mentions specifically in connection with South America, extended this reach still further. She was, in the most literal sense, carrying information to places where it was scarce. Information that could change a person's understanding of what their own life could be. The research notes that her tours helped disseminate a modern understanding of medical transition and transfeminine identity. Disseminate, to scatter widely, to spread, to make available in many places at once. Coccinelle scattered knowledge the way seeds are scattered. Widely, without complete control over where things would take root, but with the understanding that some of those seeds would find soil where they could grow. But the Parisian story has a legal dimension that the research identifies as profoundly ironic. In 1949, the city of Paris issued an edict banning travesti attractions. The specific prohibition targeted falsies, breast prosthetics, and wigs. These were understood as the defining material elements of what the authorities wanted to stop. The performers found a solution. To avoid charges of wearing falsies or wigs, they grew their own hair. They took hormones. They developed real breasts. By having a natural feminine body, by making the femininity not an artificial addition, but an actual characteristic of their bodies. They could argue that they were simply presenting themselves as they were. The irony, as the research explicitly states, is profound. The law that had been designed to suppress the performance of trans femininity instead created conditions under which trans women pursued medical transition as a way of continuing to exist in the spaces they had built. Legal persecution inadvertently accelerated medical transition. The authorities thought they were eliminating something. They were actually creating the conditions for something new. Let's rest here for a moment. With the City of Light, with the stages and the costumes and the philosophy, with coccinelle, with possibility scattered. Back in New York, the mid-century story of drag bars was unfolding in a very different context than the Parisian one. New York state law prohibited establishments from serving alcohol to disorderly persons. The state liquor authority interpreted this prohibition explicitly to include gay men, lesbians, and other gender non-conforming people. A bar that knowingly served LGBTQ+ customers was a disorderly premises whose license could be revoked. The people who were willing to create and operate queer spaces, given the very real legal risks involved, tended to be people already accustomed to operating outside the law. The mafia fit this description. And so it was that the Genovese crime family came to operate some of the most important queer nightlife spaces in mid-century New York. Before Club 82, there was the 181 Club at 181 2nd Avenue, but its story ended when the State Liquor Authority revoked its license. The reason given was specific. The 181 Club was a hangout for perverts. Let's stay with that word. Perverts. In the mouth of a government agency, in official documents, applied formally to a community of people who had done nothing more harmful than gather together in a bar. The revocation forced the Genovese family to refine their approach. This refinement produced Club 82. Club 82 was located at 82 East 4th Street in the East Village. It was a high-end destination. And to understand what high-end meant here, consider who came through the doors. Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, Elizabeth Taylor. People with access to every room in New York City chose Club 82. That tells you something no description of its technical qualities can fully convey. Something was happening there that felt more alive, or more real, than the alternatives available to people who could afford any alternative at all. The productions at Club 82 were Broadway level. One specific production is preserved in the archival record, Syncopades, of 1954. The performers included Son Teal and Kit Russell, appearing in glamorous gowns by designer John Wong. The waitstaff were women in tuxedos. The whole room was a theatre of gender, and every element was part of the production. The commercial rituals of Club 82 were specific and documented. A drink minimum was required. And there were the circulating photographers, 8 by 10-inch prints costing between $1.50 and $2 each. People paid for those photographs. They took them home. Some kept them for the rest of their lives. Some of those photographs still exist. And then there were the souvenir knockers, small wooden balls on sticks. You held one in your free hand and struck it against the table to applaud the performers on stage. Afterward, you took it home. The research notes that these knockers are now prized archival artifacts, the actual physical object you held in your hand while the show was happening. But the protection that mafia ownership provided had clear and specific limits. In the 1960s, prominent performer Angie Stardust was fired from Club 82 after she began hormone replacement therapy. The owners were interested in the performance of gender only as long as it remained a theatrical illusion rather than a medicalized reality. The space had tolerated her when the gap between her performance and her identity was sufficiently wide. When she began to close that gap, the space no longer wanted her. What happened to Angie Stardust after Club 82 is not recorded in the research we have. She disappears from the archival record at the point of her firing. She moved on. She lived her life. Where, in what conditions, with what support? We don't know. But her story is part of this history, and it belongs here. Club 82 closed in 1973, 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra and Elizabeth Taylor in the audience, Sonna Teal and Kit Russell in their gowns by John Wong, the women in tuxedos, the drink minimums, the circulating photographers, the souvenir knockers, Angie Stardust in the years before they let her go, 82 East 4th Street, 20 years. Before we leave this chapter, we need to turn to something that runs through this entire mid-century period. A thread that belongs not only to Club 82, or only to the white mainstream world of New York drag, but that has its own distinct history and its own specific cost. The story of race and class in the world of drag bars. We've already spent time with William Dorsey Swann and Alden Garrison. Let's return now to the Hamilton Lodge Ball and give it the attention it deserves. The Hamilton Lodge Ball was, the research tells us, the pinnacle of queer visibility in the era of the pansy craze. Not the most commercially successful, not the most famous outside the community, but the pinnacle of queer visibility. The place where visibility was at its most intense and most remarkable. It drew thousands of spectators to Harlem, and among those thousands was Langston Hughes, one of the defining voices of the Harlem Renaissance, a poet whose work was shaping the way Black America understood and expressed itself, and whose reputation placed him among the most important literary figures of his generation. Hughes attended the Hamilton Lodge Ball. The fact that he was there, that it was significant enough to draw someone of his stature and intellectual attention, tells you something precise about the ball's place in the cultural life of Harlem. This was not a secret gathering, not a marginal event. It was something that a serious thinker and artist found worth witnessing. The research describes the Hamilton Lodge Ball as a site where Black drag culture intersected with racial uplift politics, and where this intersection proved that performance could function as a profound tool for community formation and social visibility. Community formation, social visibility. These phrases point to what the Hamilton Lodge Ball was doing that exceeded any individual performance. For a community that was systematically made invisible, that was rendered absent from mainstream culture, from history books, from the public life of a city and a country, to be visible to itself in a room large enough to hold thousands of witnesses, was an act with meaning that transcended entertainment. The Hamilton Lodge Ball was a place where thousands of people saw each other, where community recognized itself, where the fact of existing together, in the same space, at the same time, was itself part of what was being celebrated. Alden Garrison's story carries the weight of this history in the most personal way. Garrison grew up in what the research describes as DC's alley neighborhoods. Not the avenues, not the neighborhoods that had names in newspapers or that appear in the histories of the city. The alleys, the narrow passages behind the main streets, where the most economically vulnerable black residents of Washington lived, in the poverty and crowding and the particular invisibility that comes from being in the back, behind, out of sight. To emerge from those alleys wearing eggshell satin and studded rhinestones, to wear a tiara of similar crystals, was an act that contained everything. The beauty of the costume was not incidental to its meaning. The beauty was the meaning. To be magnificent was to refuse the invisibility the world had assigned, to stand in the light, in satin and rhinestones, and be seen. And then to die at 30, alone and malnourished, after the window closed. Garrison was magnificent. The world could not sustain his magnificence past a certain point, and that is the story, the complete, exact, painful story. Let's rest here for a moment. The satin and the rhinestones, the tiara catching the light, the 30 years. Chapter 6. The turn guilds, riots, ballrooms, and the long road to the mainstream, 1962 to present. By the early 1960s, something was shifting. It would be wrong to say the world had gotten easier. It had not. The pressures on queer people in America in the early 1960s were, in many ways, as severe as they had ever been. The Cold War had brought with it a particular form of anxiety about sexuality. A suspicion that homosexuality was connected to disloyalty, to corruption, to an inability to perform the kind of upright civic virtue that the country believed it needed in its struggle against communism. Government employees were investigated for their sexuality and fired if they were found to be gay. The language of pathology, of mental illness, of social disorder, was applied routinely by medical and psychiatric establishments to anyone who was gender non-conforming. And the bars and clubs and gathering places of the community were still subject to raids, still subject to the revocation of licenses, still operating in a legal environment that treated their existence as an offense. But something was shifting underneath all of that. The community was starting, in some places, to organize, starting to build structures that were designed not just to survive the present, but to protect the future. Starting to recognize that the tools of organization, communication, coordination, mutual support, political participation, were tools that could be turned toward the specific problems that queer people faced. This recognition was not uniform. It did not happen everywhere at once. It was not a single moment of decision, but a gradual accumulation of smaller decisions, made by many different people in many different places, that added up over time to something that had not existed before. The persecution hadn't softened. The state liquor authority was still revoking licenses. Police were still raiding bars and gathering places. The language of perverts and disorderly persons was still the official vocabulary through which the state justified its treatment of the community. The laws were the same. The enforcement was the same. The daily reality of the risk of being in a queer space was the same. But the community's response to that reality was beginning to change. It was changing in the direction of organization, of building things that would last, of creating structures designed not just to get through tonight, but to protect the space for tomorrow night, and the night after that, and for years and decades into the future. And the change started as so many things in this history start. In San Francisco, in 1962, a group of San Francisco bar owners, business people, and community members formed something that had never quite existed before in American history. They called it the Tavern Guild. The Tavern Guild of San Francisco was, the research tells us, the first gay business association in the country. It was formed specifically to protect bars from police harassment. The directness of that stated purpose is striking. Not to lobby for rights in the abstract, not to produce a manifesto or hold a march, or write letters to politicians, to protect bars, specific, physical, actual bars, the buildings where the community gathered, the rooms where people could be themselves, the spaces where all of this history had been playing out. The Tavern Guild implemented a phone networking system. When police were spotted moving through the neighborhood, when a raid was anticipated or was actually beginning, word went out through the network. Bars could prepare. They could manage what was visible. They could protect their patrons. The research uses a specific phrase to describe what the system was tracking: police movement and unfriendly rumor-mongering. Both of those things could be existential threats to a queer bar in 1962. A raid could close a venue permanently, and hostile rumors, spread to attract official attention to a specific establishment, could be nearly as dangerous as a raid. The phone network turned community members into a distributed system for sharing information that was critical to survival. Knowledge that used to be scattered. One person saw a police car, another heard something, a third noticed an unusual amount of official attention on a particular block. Became collective knowledge that could be acted on before the worst happened. This was community self-defense, organized and deliberate. It was the recognition that the tools of community organization, communication, coordination, mutual support, were also tools of survival, that protecting the space where the community gathered was as important as anything else the community might want to do. The Tavern Guild was the first time those tools had been formally organized for this specific purpose in America. Take a moment with what the Tavern Guild represented. Before the Tavern Guild, the bars and clubs of San Francisco's queer community were essentially alone. Each venue faced the risk of raids and license revocations, individually, with whatever resources that specific venue could muster. There was no collective defense. There was no mechanism for sharing the information that could make the difference between a raid that caught a venue completely off guard and a raid that was anticipated and managed. There was no formal acknowledgement that the queer businesses of San Francisco had interests in common that were worth defending collectively. The Tavern Guild changed all of that, not by eliminating the risk. The risk was real and persistent, and would remain real for years, but by making the response to risk collective, by saying, what happens to one venue in this network happens to all of us, and we will act accordingly. The phone network was the practical implementation of that principle. Information about police activity flowed through the network because the network existed for exactly that purpose. The bars were in communication with each other in ways they had not been before. The community of venues was, in a meaningful sense, functioning as a community, not just sharing a neighborhood and a clientele, but actively cooperating to protect each other. This kind of organizational logic would prove enormously durable. The Tavern Guild model, businesses and community members organizing collectively to defend shared interests, would be replicated in various forms in other cities and in other contexts over the years that followed. The specific phone networking system for tracking police movement would eventually be superseded by other technologies and other methods. But the underlying principle, that collective defense was more effective than individual defense, that the community's interests were best served by solidarity rather than isolation, that principle would persist. The Tavern Guild of San Francisco, founded in 1962, was, in this sense, not just a local story. It was a model, a demonstration that organizing worked, a proof of concept for a kind of community self-defense that the queer community would need and use for decades. 3 years after the founding of the Tavern Guild, in 1965, another San Francisco institution was created. Jose Sarria declared himself Empress. Sarria was already a figure of significance in San Francisco's queer community. He had run for election to the city's Board of Supervisors in 1961, becoming the first openly gay person to run for public office in American history. His campaign had not resulted in a victory, but it had done something that a victory might not have done more effectively. It had demonstrated that queer people were a constituency, that they could organize, that they could vote as a bloc, that they could make their presence in the political system legible. Now, in 1965, Sarria created something different. By declaring himself Empress, he established what the research calls the Imperial Court, a social organization structured around the ceremonial vocabulary of royalty. There was an empress at its center, and spreading out from there was an elaborately organized hierarchy of titles and roles, nobles and courtiers, and all the theatrical apparatus of a royal court, transposed into a queer social organization in San Francisco in 1965. The Imperial Court was, the research tells us, a benevolent fundraising body, an organization centered on raising money for charitable causes and directing resources toward community needs. And it remains, the research notes, a vital part of queer social structure to this day, more than half a century after its founding. This is an extraordinary fact. An institution created in 1965 is still operating, still fulfilling the purposes for which it was created. The Imperial Court has outlasted most of the venues we've discussed tonight, has outlasted legal regimes and cultural moments and political movements. It persists. And the reason it persists is in part the reason Sarria designed it the way he did. An organization whose explicit purpose is charitable fundraising cannot have its liquor license revoked. An institution whose stated identity is ceremonial and social cannot be labeled a hangout for perverts in the way that the 181 Club was. By structuring the community institution around these forms, Sarria created something durable. 1 year after Jose Sarria declared himself Empress, something happened in San Francisco that the research recognizes as one of the most important moments of resistance in LGBTQ plus history before Stonewall. It happened in the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin is one of San Francisco's most economically precarious neighborhoods. It has always been a neighborhood of density and poverty, and the organizations that try to serve people living at the edges of what urban life provides. In the 1960s, it was where young people who had been pushed out of their homes or their previous lives ended up trying to survive with limited resources and limited support. Among those people, in the Tenderloin in the 1960s, was a community of young people the research describes as vanguard youth and street queens. They were living very publicly, in the streets and in the cheap all-night diners and restaurants that formed their informal gathering places. They were very young, often. They were very visible, and they were very vulnerable to the particular forms of abuse that the city directed at them. One of their gathering places was Compton's Cafeteria. Compton's was a 24-hour diner, the kind of place that has always existed in cities, that provides cheap food and the ability to sit for a long time over a cup of coffee without being immediately asked to leave. It was one of the places the Tenderloin's street queens gathered, one of the informal community centres that existed, not because anyone designed it as such, but because the community had nowhere else to go. The police treated the street queens of the Tenderloin badly. The research describes discriminatory police policies, a phrase that covers a great deal of daily, specific reality. Arbitrary arrests, harassment, violence, the systematic use of official power, not to protect the community from harm, but to harm the community. In August of 1966, at Compton's Cafeteria, the street queens fought back. The research tells us that the vanguard youth and street queens fought back against discriminatory police policies. What happened that night in the Tenderloin, the research recognizes as a precursor to Stonewall, as one of the moments of direct, physical, immediate resistance that signaled a shift in how the community was willing to respond to the treatment it was receiving. Stonewall would happen 3 years later, in June of 1969, in New York City, and would become the more famous and more commemorated moment. But Compton's came first, and the community that resisted. The 1970s and 1980s brought new forms and new communities. In Harlem, something that had deep roots in the ball culture of the pansy craze era, in the tradition of the Hamilton Lodge Ball, in the lineage that ran back to William Dorsey Swan's gatherings in the 1880s, was evolving into something new, and specifically its own. The research describes it as ballroom culture. Ballroom culture was a world of competitive performance, organized around social structures called houses. The House of La Beja, one of the most prominent and influential houses in the ballroom world, is mentioned by name in the research. Other houses existed alongside it, each with its own name, its own identity, its own particular way of existing in the world. Houses were family units, but not biological families. Chosen families, formed along lines of affection and recognition and community rather than birth or blood. The people who joined houses were often people who had been rejected by their biological families, or who had left circumstances in which their biological families could not or would not support who they were. The house provided what those families had not: belonging, a name, a community of people who claimed you as theirs. Within the ballroom world, houses competed against each other in formal balls. Members performed in categories. The research notes that these categories critiqued and emulated mainstream society. A precise and important description. The categories were not simple imitations of mainstream life, simple performances of the ordinary. They were something more complex, engaged with mainstream society, in dialogue with it, taking its forms and working with and against them. Executive realness, a category in which performers presented themselves convincingly as corporate executives, as people who belonged in boardrooms and business settings, was both aspiration and critique simultaneously. To perform executive realness was to claim, in a space where that claim was recognized and celebrated and judged on its merits, the kind of social position and identity that mainstream American society routinely denied to queer people of color. It was both celebration and commentary, both the performance of the thing and the knowing examination of what that thing meant and who it was available to and who it was not. Ballroom culture provided, the research tells us, a space for queer people of color to find community and recognition through categories that critiqued and emulated mainstream society. Community and recognition, not small things. For people who had been systematically denied both, who had been excluded from the family structures, the religious institutions, the civic organizations, the economic systems that mainstream society used to provide belonging and recognition. The ballroom world offered an alternative, entire and complete. An entire social world, with its own structure, its own hierarchy, its own system of recognition and reward and competition and celebration. The houses were families. The balls were celebrations and competitions. The categories were the vocabulary through which the community understood and communicated its own complexity. This was not a world designed for outside consumption. It was not built to attract tourists or celebrity patrons or mainstream press attention. It was community for community, built and maintained by and for the Black and Latino queer people of New York City who needed it. Let's rest for a moment with the ballroom world before we move on. The houses, the competitions, the categories, the chosen families who competed together and celebrated together and took care of each other. These were spaces that did not exist to be seen by the outside world. They were not performing for an audience of mainstream America. They were not trying to win approval from institutions that had historically denied them any. They were doing something more fundamental and in some ways more difficult. They were creating a world, an entire parallel social world, with its own rules and its own hierarchy and its own vocabulary and its own ways of recognizing excellence and community. The House of La Beja and the houses that existed alongside it were not making an argument to mainstream society. They were building an alternative to it, a place where the recognition that mainstream society withheld, based on race, on gender, on sexuality, on economics, was given freely and often joyfully to the people who deserved it and had been denied it everywhere else. And within that world, the art of performance reached a particular kind of intensity, because these performers were performing for audiences who were themselves performers, who knew what the work cost, who understood. In 1984, in Tompkins Square Park in the East Village of Manhattan, something happened that would eventually shift drag's relationship to mainstream visibility in a way that none of the earlier chapters in this history had. It started small. Everything lasting starts small. Lady Bunny and a group of performers from the Pyramid Club, a nightclub on Avenue A in the East Village that was a center of the downtown New York creative and nightlife scene in the 1980s, held what the research describes as an impromptu event in the park. Tompkins Square Park, was a public park, an open outdoor space in a neighborhood that was, in the mid-1980s, experiencing its own complicated history of gentrification and community resistance and artistic ferment. It was not a bar. It did not require a liquor license. It could not have its license revoked. It was the park. Anyone could be there. The event was spontaneous in the sense that the most generative things often are, not carefully planned and formally organized, but arising from a group of creative people who knew each other and trusted each other and had the specific kind of chemistry that makes people decide, on a particular day, to do something. This impromptu gathering became Wigstock. The name, a play on Woodstock, the legendary 1969 music festival that had become a touchstone for a generation's sense of what collective celebration could be, would over the years become its own landmark, its own reference point, its own piece of history. The research describes its evolution from a grungy 80s festival into a massive 90s concert. The 1980s version of Wigstock, still relatively small, still held in the park, still carrying the rough-edged vitality of the downtown East Village scene that had produced it, was a different thing from the 1990s version, which had grown into something that could attract tens of thousands of people and draw mainstream press coverage and eventually documentary film treatment. What Wigstock did, that was genuinely new, was identified precisely in the research. It signaled drag's emergence from the dimly lit nightclub into the sunlight of mainstream documentary film. The dimly lit nightclub. Let's stay with that image for a moment, because it captures something essential about the long history we've been tracing tonight. The bars and clubs and underground spaces where drag had lived for most of the 20th century. The speakeasies that were literally below ground. The clubs that kept their lights low by necessity or design. The spaces that existed in the gap between public and private were all, in one sense or another, dimly lit. Not always literally, though often literally, but in the broader sense. Limited visibility, contained within specific communities, accessible only if you knew where to go and knew someone and were willing to risk being in the right room at the wrong moment when the police arrived. Wigstock, in the park, in the open air, on a summer afternoon, was something different. Something that anyone walking through the East Village could encounter without seeking it out specifically. Something that documentary filmmakers could document in a way that would reach audiences who had never been near Tompkins Square Park and never been in any of those dimly lit nightclubs. Something could now be seen that had always been there, but had never been this visible. The person who most completely embodied and accelerated this shift from underground to mainstream was RuPaul Andre Charles. RuPaul had built his career in the New York club scene, in the specific world of downtown Manhattan nightlife that had been producing extraordinary creativity and extraordinary performers for years. He was known. He was working. He was a figure in that world who helped define it. And then, in 1993, he released a single, Supermodel, You Better Work. The song reached audiences far beyond the club scene that had shaped RuPaul and that he had helped to shape. It became a genuine pop hit, the kind of hit that appears on the radio, that gets played in stores, that enters the general cultural vocabulary, whether or not any particular listener has any connection to the world that produced it. And RuPaul moved, the research tells us, from the NYC club scene to global stardom. Global stardom. Not downtown Manhattan celebrity, not the reputation of someone well known within a specific world and unknown outside it. Global. This adjective marks a genuine break from everything that had come before. Julian Eltinge had been the world's highest paid actor, but within the specific context of vaudeville, a world that had its own geographic limits. The performers at Finocchio's had been famous within San Francisco's nightlife and within the Let's walk slowly backward through this history, one final time before we close for the evening. Let's walk slowly and rest with each thing before moving to the next. The Globe Theatre in London, the heavy dresses dragging across the rehearsal floor. A word that emerged from a physical sensation and would eventually travel further than anyone in that room could have known. William Dorsey Swann, in Washington, D.C., in the 1880s. A formerly enslaved man creating gatherings where the intersectionality of race and gender expression was a radical political act. The beginning of a lineage. The first thread of something that would run forward through more than a century of history. Julian Eltinge on the vaudeville stage. The world's highest paid actor, at times out-earning Charlie Chaplin. Female impersonation as celebrated mainstream entertainment. A pre-criminalization era when the art was praised as sophisticated theatrical craft. The 18th Amendment. The speakeasies. The smoky haze where respectability and criminality blurred. The fairylands where patrons were encouraged to spurn convention. The pansy craze, with gender non-conforming performers catapulted into fashionable stardom. New York City, the undisputed capital. Greenwich Village and Harlem, pansy acts integrated into Broadway and major nightclubs. Jean Malin at West 54th Street, his hand on his hip, the room watching him. The definitive master of ceremonies of the New York scene. Ray Bourbon, illustrating the voyeuristic thrill sought by heterosexual audiences. Clifton Webb, leaning into his Nance roles, using his proximity to mainstream theatre to thrive, while others faced increasing persecution. Chicago's relatively tolerant atmosphere during the peak. Los Angeles, as a destination for performers fleeing East Coast crackdowns. Miami's tropical fairyland, hierarchies momentarily suspended in exclusive casinos. The Hamilton Lodge Ball in Harlem, thousands of people, Langston Hughes in the crowd, black drag culture intersecting with racial uplift politics, performance as community formation, as social visibility, Alden Garrison, the belle of the Pansy Ball, at the 1931 Baltimore Ball, a flowing gown of eggshell satin with studded rhinestones, a tiara of similar crystals, resistance against the poverty of D.C.'s alley neighborhoods, his death in 1938, alone and malnourished, at 30 years old, the devastating end of a period of visibility, the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the Great Depression's moral backlash against excess, the 1934 Production Code, erasing queer characters from Hollywood films, the end of the pansy craze. Finocchio's at 506 Broadway Street, North Beach, San Francisco, Marjorie and Joseph Finocchio, Walter Hart, Lucian Phelps, Ray Bourbon on that stage, more than 50 years as a stop on the Grey Line nightclub tour. The dual identity, commercial sightseeing and vital sanctuary simultaneously. 63 years of lights on, 1936 to 1999. The shift from female impersonation to drag. From theatrical illusion to lived authenticity. Finocchio's hosting drag queens, trans people, and cisgender performers who began to shift the art form away from mere mimicry towards something more true. Paris, 1946. Madame Arthur, opening in Pigalle. The Nursery. The Grotesque Comedy. The Femininity Played for Laughs. Marcel Huysmans and Madame Germaine, opening Le Carrousel near the Champs-Élysées. The Sincerity. The International Wealthy Clientele. The Femininity approached as genuine. Both venues as ground zero for the development of modern transfeminine identities in Europe. Coccinelle. Jacqueline Dufresnoy, the global symbol of trans possibility. Europa di Notte in 1958. Surgical transition in Casablanca in 1960, documented extensively in the world press. International tours, particularly in South America, disseminating a modern understanding of medical transition and transfeminine identity. The Parisian Edict of 1949, banning travesti attractions and prohibiting falsies and wigs. The performers who responded by growing their own hair and taking hormones to develop natural femininity. Legal persecution, inadvertently accelerating medical transition. The new hegemonic way of being trans, created by the law that was trying to prevent something else. The 181 Club at 181 2nd Avenue, shut down after the State Liquor Authority labelled it a hangout for perverts. The Genovese crime family, refining their management of queer spaces through figures like Anna Genovese. Club 82 at 82 East 4th Street. Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra, and Elizabeth Taylor in the audience. Broadway-level productions, including Syncopades of 1954. Sonna Teal and Kit Russell in their glamorous gowns by designer John Wong. Women in tuxedos waiting. And here we are, near the end of our time together, tonight. It's late, the kind of time that belongs to this kind of story. The hour when the day's busyness has settled, when the world is quieter, when there's space for a different kind of attention. I want to spend a few more quiet minutes simply sitting with what we've been exploring, not rushing to the end, just being with it for a little while. There is a kind of room that exists across time. We started there, tonight, with that idea, and we've visited a great many of those rooms in the hours we've spent together. The rehearsal room at the Globe Theatre, where a young man in a heavy dress learned the weight of performing what the world required. The back rooms and private spaces of Washington, D.C. in the 1880s, where William Dorsey Swann was creating something that the world had no interest in creating for him, and where a lineage began. The speakeasies of the 1920s, the underground fairylands, where the normal rules had already been broken by the act of walking through the door, and so other things became possible too. The stage at Finocchio's, where Walter Hart and Lucian Phelps and Ray Bourbon stood in those lights over decades, where the art of female impersonation began to become something else, something rooted in lived authenticity rather than theatrical illusion. The room near the Champs-Élysées in Paris, where Coccinelle performed with sincerity and made herself into a symbol of possibility for people who needed exactly that symbol, in countries she would never visit. 82 East 4th Street, where Sonna Teal wore a gown by designer John Wong, and Judy Garland sat in the audience, and the souvenir knockers kept time on the tables, and Angie Stardust performed in the years before they let her go. The Hamilton Lodge Ball in Harlem, where thousands gathered on winter nights, where Langston Hughes watched, where community formed itself in the presence of all those witnesses. The Tenderloin, in August of 1966, where the street queens of Compton's Cafeteria decided that enough was enough and fought back. The Harlem ballroom world, where the houses were families, and the balls were celebrations, and the categories were a vocabulary through which a community understood its own complexity. Tompkins Square Park in 1984, where something impromptu became Wigstock, and something that had lived in the dim light began to move into the sun. And the stages of RuPaul's Drag Race, where the art that had begun in underground rooms was seen by millions of people around the world. All of these rooms, all of these lights. The thing that connects them all is simple and remarkable. In all of them, in their different ways, for different people in different periods, someone could be, more fully, themselves. That is a small thing to say, and an enormous thing to mean. Think about what it is to not be able to be fully yourself in the ordinary world. To move through daily life, through the street, through the workplace, through the grocery store and the doctor's office, and the family dinner table, carrying something that you cannot bring with you into those spaces, something that has to wait at the door, something that you put away when you go out into the world and retrieve, perhaps in the privacy of a room, perhaps in the company of a very few people who know, when the official part of the day is done. Think about what that costs, over years and decades. The energy of carrying it, the vigilance of keeping it contained, the loneliness of moving through spaces where no one knows what you're holding. And then think about walking through a different door. A door that opens into a room where the thing you've been carrying can come with you, where you don't have to put it away, where the people in the room know, not because you've told them, but because they're carrying their own versions of the same thing, and recognition is immediate and wordless and complete. That room doesn't have to be magical in any theatrical sense. It doesn't have to have a stage or a marquee or a name that will eventually appear in a history book. It just has to be a place where the thing you are is allowed. The drag bars and ballrooms and speakeasies and cafeterias of this history were that kind of place for the people who found them. Not all of them were safe. Many of them were actively dangerous, subject at any moment to raids and arrests and the other violences that the state directed at queer spaces. Not all of them were welcoming to everyone. The racial divides of American society did not disappear at the doors of the clubs, and the specific community structures of the ballroom world existed in part because the mainstream drag scene had not made adequate space for the queer.